Welcome, everyone. This is the Buddhist Yoga and Medicine podcast. I'm honored to have guest speaker Dr. Sheryl Petty, who is a deep equity and systems change consultant, as well as an ordained Nakma, a priest in an African-based tradition from the Yoruba called Lukumi, and also a professional and who has 30 years of professional contemplative experience in this area. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thank you so much.
So today's conversation draws many different fields of discussion. We wanted to touch on the relationship between one, inner work, and social justice. But before we begin, for the listeners, there are a number of resources that I'm drawing from. And Dr. Petty, if you can share with us some of the documents on your website, Movement Tapestries, that may be helpful for the listeners to access.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, you could check out movementtapestries.com and you'll find publications on there around systems change and equity, my thinking on that. Another one around change management and deep equity. How does the process of change happen over time in organizational systems and other macro systems? And then a shorter work, more recent one entitled Deep Connectedness, which is around the relationship between equity, systems, and healing.
Thank you. I was wondering if we could actually start there. This latest publication is about, again, deep equity and connectedness. Can you tell us a little bit about how we understand this relationship between deep connectedness and social change?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So systems, right? You know, many people have been talking about systems for some time, and you see images that folks come up with, whether they're maps or networks. And as Tantric Buddhist practitioners, we often talk about tsa, you know, channels, right? And how the energy is moving through those channels. Well, organizational systems, you know, groupings of people are similar. They also have tsa and they also have long, you know, that moves through those channels, and that energy can become entangled and knotted, just like it can in our own bodies, you know, your own profession and practice. That happens at the macro level, as we all know. That can happen in families, that can happen in formal organizations of any type, any place that human beings are gathered. We can have these sort of aggregate versions of tsa and long. Tigle is another version of a conversation that we could have, but I don't think we'll get to today. But we might. You know, so this notion of what is healing and wellness when that energy is moving in a fluid, healthy way, when it's unconstrained, uncontorted, there aren't, you know, sort of kinks and twists happening. How do those kinks get there at the macro level? How do we help systems to unknot themselves so that our goodness, you know, wisdom, healing, wellness can flow more readily? So.
There's a term that's I was hoping you could define is deep equity. And here in this paper, it's mentioned inequity is a state of fragmentation, disjointedness, lack of flow, rupture, and stagnation. Can you define for us what deep equity is and might look like in an organizational system, and also its relation to systems change?
Yeah, he asked the voluminous dissertation question. I'll do my best in a sound bite. So the word deep, you know, the qualifier, some years ago, I was thinking about this term equity, which is still being used or thrown around in many social change circles, which is useful and helpful and good, but wanting to distinguish, you know, what I would call equity light practices from those that have depth and the opportunity for a greater, more pervasive and long-lasting transformation. You know, so lighter practices might be attending to things like diversity or demographic differences, or sort of surface level manifestations of diversity and inclusion practices, which are important, good, helpful, need to happen, but don't attend to things like cumulative impact, what has been happening over time, either in a lifetime or in generations. Some the organizations that we are in or that I work with may have patterns that are decades old. Some, if they've been around for a long time, I had a client, they had patterns that were around since they were instituted 70 years ago. And so what is the remapping or sort of understanding the origin story or the origin energetic template of how those patterns came to be, and then how that the releasing of those entanglements and those knots might happen. So depth attends to this notion of cumulative. It also attends to the structures, processes, and systems that may be happening in an organization. It also attends to the emotional and affective and relational parts, how people are with each other in their hearts. It attends to organizational culture, and promotes sort of healing pathways, combining this structural technical with these emotional, affective, and energetic pieces. That's maybe 80% of it. If you read the publications I mentioned, there are frameworks and images and diagrams and models in those that could be helpful. And if I was really good, I'd have a page number for you in the change management and equity one, but I don't have the page numbers handy. But those are some of the hallmarks that we understand systems as complex, and equity at depth can attend to that complexity. And it's not just mechanical, but there's this sort of human aspect to it as well. We are feeling beings, we are relational beings, we are energetic beings, and organizations are organisms. And so we're attending to all of that, that texture, right? This is that.
Dr. Petty, how do organizations recognize those patterns, or how do newly forming or budding organizations make that an explicit goal, is to start with healthy systems? How do we recognize, or how do we begin?
Which should we start with? Recognizing, you mean from organizations that are pre-existing or have a history, and then brand new, just emergent? Which one? Where shall we go?
Those with a past, and those that are just newly emerging.
Okay, we want to do both. All right. Because the answer is different, which is why I think there's similarities and overlaps, and I love these questions so much. People don't often ask me about this exact kind of thing in these ways, so I really appreciate it. Maybe I'll start with the pre-existing organizations. And, obviously some of these things will depend on size. How large? Is it a 10-person organization? Is it a 200-person organization? Is it a 2,000-person organization, et cetera? Some of the approaches will hold no matter what size, and some of them, it depends on size. Some things obviously are harder the larger the system is, right? The more people involved, the more approaches and the time frame is different, and the approaches become more layered when you have to work to support more larger numbers of people to synchronize and begin to see together. And synchronize doesn't mean uniformity. It doesn't mean we all have to think the same or have groupthink. It means we do need to be receptive and open and willing, right? A sort of primary Buddhist tenet, this receptivity and openness to see from multiple perspectives, to see I've got my own experience of reality or what's happening here in this system, in this organization. And there are other people who are in other roles with other identities, with other lengths of tenure, maybe in other positions, geographically or functionally in the organization, whether they're operational or programmatic, and so on. Legal, HR, board, et cetera, members, volunteers, staff. We are all bringing this amalgam of the ways that we see. How do we remain receptive to, there are multiple truths happening here, multiple perspectives, and how do we attend to the uh, complexity, multiplicity of that? Some of those things might feel like they're competing. Some of those things may feel like they're vying for reality. And some things may feel truer than others. And some of those perspectives may have a broader vista, be clearer, and some might be more limited and or distorted. So there are various processes that are talked about, particularly in the change management and equity publication, around how do you support a system to see together? But part of that requires supporting the system with bravery. How do you help a system to get brave? There are always, you could say, canaries, in the mine. There are always really wise, clear-seeing, clear-thinking people in systems. I'm hard-pressed to think. Maybe there's some exceptions to that. Maybe there are some systems where everybody is in a radical state of confusion. That could be possible. But there are usually amazing, brilliant folks there who are really seeing system dynamics really clearly. A lot of the work is around how do you unleash and unconstrain their ability to let their wisdom shine forth and you could say fertilize, irrigate, right, the system. And how do you do that in a way that doesn't overtax and overburden? Because a lot of times those folks are the ones who are always being gone to for this very same work, metabolizing the toxins and contortions of the system. How to resource folks in the aggregate so that we're not exploiting folks as labor in the process of joint seeing and healing at a macro level. So that's maybe, I don't know, 20-25% of what's needed. That's pre-existing organization.
Yeah. And then how do newly forming and
Mhm.
developing organizations put systems in place that might promote sustainability and equity over time?
I love this question too. It's like a perfect, incredible question that literally I do not believe I've ever been asked or can remember hearing. So first I would say it depends on who's in the room, right? So what's the cross section or amalgam of experiences and expertise that are brought to bear to conceive of and vision the system, right? Are there enough? It's like if you're trying to build a house and you brought the carpenter, you got an electrician, you've got someone who can do interior decorating, you got a landscaper, but no one brought a plumber. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's similar, is the amalgam of people present visioning, is there enough cross section or complementarity among their skill sets such that they can vision in a comprehensive way? You know what I'm saying? In a more well-rounded and a more holistic manner. So that important aspects won't accidentally, inadvertently be left out or unattended to or unplanned for. And then their afterthoughts. Imagine you built a whole house and there was no plumbing. Imagine what you might have to do. The walls are up, the floor is laid. People are moving in couches and they're like, oh my God, how do we get the water in here? Similarly, so one has to sort of have some baseline nuts and bolts of you know, that's the foundational aspects of how organizations work. Again, there's the structural technical pieces, there's these affective, emotional, cultural, relational pieces um, uh, that are really important to bring to bear. And I want to say, just I plug this back in the day, many years ago, probably 20-15 years ago or something like this. The first time I heard someone use the terms structural, technical, and I think she said structural, technical, and cultural was from an education equity practitioner, Jeannie Oakes from UCLA. And I just want to acknowledge her because my thinking sort of riffed on that over the years, that there are these multiple dimensions of organizations that we have to be attending to if we are to both plan well, as you say, in terms of forming and sustaining that health, and then course correcting when we find something has gone awry, when there's healing that's needed. But a lot of times the requisite broad enough array of skill sets, I will say, is not always brought to bear. And therein, I think, lies the challenge, because I don't know that everyone is necessarily mm, fully aware of all the pieces that are needed. And you know what? We don't all have to be aware of everything, but we do, as practitioners, we do have to be open. So that's the thing. I don't have to know everything, but I do need to be receptive that there's something beyond my knowledge, which then allows me to partner effectively and see bigger and do more.
I've lost this one thread. It was such a powerful statement. And it was about the relationship between deep equity and systems change. And one,
Okay.
if there is systems change, an attempt without deep equity, it was also limited, and vice versa. Do you recall
Thank
a,
you.
one of these publications?
Absolutely, 100%. You'll probably find that statements on that in the Systems Change and Equity publication, the very first one. And just so folks know, the Systems Change and Equity publication is cover is brown. The Change Management and Equity publication cover is green, and the Deep Connectedness publication cover is black. There are other publications on the website. So there's movementtapestries.com, and that has most of them. Um, so there are many, many systems change practitioners around the world. They work in various types of settings, corporate, healthcare, philanthropic, nonprofit, governmental, and so on. That's the systems change field has many decades right under its belt. It has only been in recent years that some in the systems change field, recent, 10, 15-ish, that's an approximate number, have been asking questions about what is the relationship between equity and systems change. That publication, the brown cover one, was produced really to give visibility to the kinds of dialogues that happen all the time in the universe that I spend a lot of time in or have spent a lot of time in. Those who work in the social change field, but who are deep equity practitioners, but who are systemic thinkers, who think in a systemic, integrated, interrelational, way. The word tendril, would not be inappropriate here, right? Network, this mycelial, this way. Because equity attends to things like power and privilege, cumulative impact and burden, disproportionate impact on populations of people by characteristics and identities that are predictable, right? Population level harm, right? Whether you're talking healthcare, education, or where people can work or live, all of these things that are at the group level, right? This is not just individual and interpersonal, but at institutional and systemic or communal or societal levels. So deep equity attends to all of those levels and all of those things, while understanding how systems function in a generic way. So systems change practitioners in a generic way may not attend to things like identity, history, power, harm, burden, and the predictability of that, because dominant culture patterns are to suppress memory of those things and treat us as monolithic generic humans and only see us in our universal. There is the universal, our shared humanity, but those approaches ignore the particularity. And deep equity retains both of those, along with the complexity of how systems function.
I want to segue to, there was a article I was first introduced to your work. So this statement is somewhat of a segue because I would also like listeners to hear your insight also from spiritual practice, contemplative practice. But there was one statement that equity at depth is compassion. Equity at depth is compassion. Anything you can share about this view?
Yeah, that I think that was in it might have been the book chapter, or there's also a journal that the Nalanda Institute and Joe Loizzo and his colleagues put out. Yeah, I thank you for that. I'm going to go back to this deep connectedness thing, right? We are feeling. So what happens when we are disconnected, right? When we're disconnected from ourselves, right? We do a lot of these, things with the heart chakra, and even yoga asana practitioners, we're doing these heart openings, right? And even folks who are not necessarily practitioners, the word chakra is very, in sort of a common lexicon in many places. So this notion of let's just start with connectedness to self, right? Whether it's um, mind body, mind body emotions, upper chakras, all the way down to base chakras, perineum, root chakra. How connected am I in my mind? How connected am I in my heart? How does that inform what I then do and what I think? So what happens when we're in states of disconnectedness internally, right? The foot goes numb, the hand goes numb. Some part of us has atrophied. We are no longer in touch with it. How many people will talk about they can't even feel their pelvis, their genitals, right? Folks have, either lost touch with and or never been connected to that. And so what wisdom is cut off, is shunted, is not accessible, right? What harm might we cause if our foot is numb? We could knock our foot into something and not even know that we're cut. We could kick someone and not even feel it, right? Or step on something, because depending on the depth of numbness and level of numbness, this is what we're talking about in connectedness and awakening these things. We want to awaken those things in our bodies, awaken those things in our minds, awaken those things in our emotions, because it is that level of connectedness and awakeness and awareness that allows us to then attend, and then we're feeling. And then bodhicitta, right? The awakened heart mind, our natural, wise intelligence and compassion is present automatically. It's present automatically, right? If we're in a state of connectedness, we feel others' pain, right? Where it matters to us what's happening, where we're connected in a way that it's not intellectual, it's visceral, it's felt. And then some folks, it's interesting that for some folks that can be a scary thought if we're unaccustomed to it, if our channels have been blocked or closed for a long time. Some people may be afraid of things like overwhelm. What may be overloaded? Will we overload our circuits, right? You can think of that, like, because there's some, like even plugs there, we have to watch the voltage, right? So how do we train our tsa to be able to and train our capacity to be able to run, as one of my teachers used to say, sort of greater and greater degrees of freedom, greater and greater degrees of connectedness, greater and greater degrees of awareness. As practitioners in many lineages, sometimes they say, start with, you know, have a good thought, or you know share your compassion with the people closest to you. Okay, now extend that a little further out to those, in your family, or your neighborhood, or your village. Now extend that further out to include people that you have a hard time with, or you may find extremely challenging, and extend that further out and out and out, to the point where at some point that we hear that at some point that compassion can be pervasive, limitless, dauntless, unbound, right? This is this thing, So to me, that state of connectedness allows us to make wise choices, and out of that, deep equity becomes possible because we are attending at a level of specificity and particularity and nuance. This is Padma wisdom, right? Discerning, that discernment wisdom is very precise, and we know that that lotus family is that state of connectedness when it's in its um, clear state, right? Its obscured state looks different when we are experiencing it contorted. We can be super graspy, but in its clear state, it is very precisely attended to detail. Deep equity is exactly like that. It's attended to detail. Nothing is left out. Nothing is left out. The particularity of human manifestation matters, but we're not grasping.
The first publication I read of yours, I didn't get past the first page, and I thought, all right, just rest here. There's this, you really need to pay attention. It's called Waking Up to All of Ourselves, Inner Work, Social Justice, and Systems Change. And for listeners, it really speaks to this as a practice, how you can bridge your own inner work or practice. Can I just read some of the bullet points? And if there's anything you can speak about, disconnection or fragmentation, but this list really spoke to me. The difference between nascent and deeper approaches to each of the three domains. The difference between this really spoke to me, a love-based or rage-fueled approach to social justice, a deep love-based approach to social justice already having inner work embedded, the danger of spiritual bypassing, the explicit or our ability to explicitly address power and privilege in progressive approaches to social change, and the non-dual relationship between individual and collective liberation. So it seems to map out how we bring our inner work to these domains of practice. Is there anything you could share about this framework or how you map this out?
Mhm. I love your the challenge for me to bring things into a soundbite. I appreciate the challenge of it. How fantastic. So the domains in that publication, just so folks are aware, and hopefully I can remember them. This is in the journal. The three domains are spiritual practice, equity, and systems change, just so folks know. And so, as James said, or do I call you Dr. Bay? Am I
James is
supposed to?
great.
Um, as James said, each of those, from my perspective, have nascent approaches, right? We can have nascent, or newer learner approaches to equity, newer learner approaches to spiritual practice, newer learner approaches to systems change. And then they each can have, more developed approaches, when one has been practicing and engaging in those domains, equity, spiritual practice, and systems change for longer periods of time. So, it's just to know that, again, we all want to stay humble, and receptive, and know that, we may be deep in some things or newer learners in other things and not know a thing about something else. And so how do we, just stay humble, back to that notion of complementarity, and knowing that we stay open and we can complement, our own gifts and wisdom and skill sets by partnering with and connecting with others who bring their brilliance and wisdom, and together we see bigger and can do more. And how amazing is that? um the love base, and rage filled, it's interesting, this came out, I think, before or somewhere around Lama Rod Owen's book, which I haven't read, but I did glance at it. I'm so happy that it exists. So I can't speak to how the amazing way that I imagine that he has spoken about rage and anger. But so let's talk about that in terms of Vajra family, right? From a Vajrayana perspective or Tantric Buddhist perspective, right? So we know that Vajra family in its contorted or distorted state, is this rage, right? This rage that can become myopic, that can become very insular, that can become, it loses its panorama, right? But in a clear state, it is this panoramic, we call it mirror-like wisdom, right? This mirror-like clarity. And, there are wisdom beings, yidam, deity practice, who are very ferocious in their mien, in their presentation, because in that family, in the Vajra family and many other families, because of that clear seeing. So the clear sight doesn't leave, but their bodhicitta is blazing, like literally they're surrounded by like flames. It's blazing. So that's what we want to awaken. It's not that we want to suppress or mute, or dumb down our ferocity. We want to ensure that it is clear so that we do not cause harm to ourselves and others. This is the point. And how do we not, confuse a clear state with a confused state? Part of that discernment is that compassion is not selective. It's not just for our friends and families or people who look like us or think like us, that bodhicitta is available and can be extended to understanding and comprehending the realities and worldviews of people who think and look radically different from us and who may be causing harm. This is Avalokiteshvara Chenrezig, right? This unbounded, ability to love. And yeah, so that's what I would say. There's a way to be fierce and loving, and people are talking about that now, and I think that's great. And it's important that we not be, that we not get it twisted, be like, I'm being really fierce, and be like, okay, let's just make sure that we're like really, really connected and not messing it up. So that's what I would say. I know you mentioned a couple other things, but I can pause there.
Yes. Um, Dialogue, listening. One of the next topic was the danger of spiritual bypassing.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm wondering, some top relevant topics might be the term you gave was numbness or numbing, or conflict avoidance. How do
Mhm.
we see spiritual bypass, and how do we enter into a greater dialogue between institutional members, or yeah, within an
Mhm.
organization?
Yeah, there's a great article in that publication as well that I did not write, by Carla Sheryl and Judith Simmer Brown on spiritual bypassing in the mindfulness movement. So those who are in uh, that portion of practice, there are many things written in that article that may be really helpful and useful to you all. So there's generic bypassing, and then there's equity specific bypassing, right? So spiritual bypassing, right? You all know this, when we're using our spiritual practice as an escape route. We're using it to, like get high and, not have to sort of deal with day-to-day life and reality. As tantric practitioners, or those of us who are, have practices that are like that are Vajrayana, or employ similar approaches or methodologies. We're training to be really present with reality in its totality and all of its manifestations, with this openness and clear seeing, this openness and kindness, this wisdom and skillful means. So we're training, so that we're not, we don't want things always necessarily to be quiet and calm and peaceful. There are times we can have that inner state of quiet and calm and peace, but the outer things may be very volatile and wild. How do we maintain our presence and clarity in the midst of that, so that we expand our repertoire for dealing with life, just for being, for every day? So this is the sort of generic form of addressing spiritual bypassing. Equity, when you sort of connect spiritual bypassing to equity, there's bypassing when we want to ignore things like history, or impact or burden or power, or demographics, race, gender, um, sexual orientation, class, all of these identities, when we want to ignore those things as being irrelevant to our spiritual practice, because we think that attending to them is fixation. Attending is not necessarily fixation, though it could be. So yeah, we do need to be mindful that we're not gripping onto anything, but that we are present to. That is part of our, those of us who are um, have commitments. We are committed to being present and staying present, and again attending to these details, right? This notion of, right, Padmasambhava, as fine as the grains of sand, right? As fine as the grains of sand. We want our view to be vast, but we want to attend. And part of that attending from an equity perspective is the particularity of our identities, again, without grasping. So, because if we don't do that, then we are bypassing, all humans, and if we would just, there's a universal and there's a particular, and we're doing both wisdom and skillful means together. So these are metaphors for, how we engage in non-dual practice, or some aspects.
One of my final questions looks at levels of deep equity work. There was mention of individual, institutional, systemic, and this one is moving further with the interpersonal.
Mhm.
These two uh, qualities of presence and listening, can you speak to how that relates to power dynamics and voices and needs of individuals within an organization. How can we have a healthy dialogue within an ecosystem of an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say something on that, and I want to hear you talk about where that question comes from. I mean, because I could guess, uh, so I'm going back to openness. I'm going back to openness and receptivity, right? Listening is a synonym
Yeah.
for that. Our primary vow, right? Openness, emptiness, humility, receptivity, listening. Those are all in the same family, right? We have these commitments to remain open. I have my perspective and experiences, and I'm open to, willing to listen to, hear, because I love, because I care, because it matters, or simply because without anything after it, you know. Um, I feel like, the question you're asking, we're looking at this same thing. We're coming in different doors or windows, or we're entering through different angles at this same phenomenon. It goes back to this receptivity. And you those of us who have power in whatever ways we have that in our lives, we need to be present to that and aware of it enough to attend to how we are wielding it, right? Again, lest we do harm. There are many powerful beings, right, that we engage with in our practice. We engage with them to awaken that in ourselves, that sense of power. People talk about Vajrapani, right? This capacity, powerfulness, in expressing our wisdom and gifts, for the benefit of others, and to just experience the goodness of reality. So, but we can't be sort of willy-nilly like that. So this is um what did Sean Genwright, write about the mirror and window. We've got to be doing our mirror work and not just, looking out, out, out. I'm doing. Okay, am I attending to and looking at Sheryl? And am I reflecting on, do I have mirrors around me of people who can mirror back to me, dang, people who can mirror back to me how I am manifesting and being and how that's being experienced by others? And am I willing to take that in and learn and practice in being different if needed? So that's what I would say. Do you want to say anything about where the question comes from for you?
Absolutely. And then if you can share any insight from some subtext or narrative that you're hearing, but I've been really touched in the last few years partnering with certain organizations. And that's why I have this question about for newly budding organizations. So
Mm,
institutions with a long history, I
mm,
know from consultancy with people who have worked with these organizations, they really made a concerted effort to center certain voices and
mm,
identities.
mm,
Um, and I'm thinking about who are the stakeholders. This is some of the languaging I learned from your writings and publications also. Um, but really valuing certain voices and their involvement in this dialogue. So sometimes these organizations are now not only concerned about the content, but also the context and culture. So it touches me when I really feel like this is a partnership. And I see equity in terms of how people are represented, the platform, even the payment,
mm,
even the
mm,
centering. And when I
mm,
look at the sustainability of these directives, I say, wow, I
mm,
think in the future, I really need to build that in from the
mm,
start. And when
mm,
I see organizations that have had challenging paths and have new trajectories, I see a glimmer of health. And it's
mm,
very important in the realm of Dharma, healthcare, education. So when I see how the level of clarity at which this is being discussed in your publications, it strikes me and it just
mm,
makes me think I have to really be explicit and conscious about this
mm,
because presence and listening, it really comes down to spiritual practice. I even think of reactivity versus the initial thing that you were talking about, this connectedness, this love, and this flow between parts of a system. So I don't
Mhm.
know, just that's where I'm coming from. I
Mhm.
have been touched and I see, wow, I remember going to this retreat center or organization 20 years ago
Mhm.
and then stepping in there now. And is
Mhm.
this a healthy partnership? Is it tokenism? I know
Mhm.
this is a broad
Mhm.
discussion, but this is where I'm coming
Mhm.
from. Are there any
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. I really appreciate you mentioning and noting this notion of centering certain voices and identities. It's interesting. Volumes have been said and written, and there's so many brilliant practitioners, so many brilliant equity practitioners, working inside of organizations and communities as consultants and so on, who've been doing work for a long time, and currently. So what I'll say about it is I'm just looking again, I'm looking for the pith version of it. Um, we have to attend to whose voices have been repressed and suppressed and why. What wisdom is not being experienced and felt, and benefiting the whole. What fear is driving those things. How conscious and unconscious folks are, of that. When we are or are observing power hoarding and what happens with that, we can talk from a Talon perspective around, what channels have been knotted up that are making it so that either we're oblivious, don't see, or we think that the patterns that are happening are correct, are right, are proper, are what they should be. What state of contortion might that be? And again, can we just go back to our basic vow of openness and receptivity and humility, and our concomitant, our um, complementary vow, right? These are they're not disconnected. They're not two, of compassion and being connected. When one is hearing pain in a system, our commitment is to be present to that and open to that and attend to that and get radically humble. Doesn't mean abdicating the chair that we're in. So if we're in a seat that holds power, we have to be present to that power and figure out how to profoundly partner, and then maybe give up the seat, maybe share the seat, maybe partner in new ways, thinking about, again, skill sets, capacity, wisdom, and expertise. Is there some joint? There are many joint structures or co-structures or council structures or circle structures that folks are experimenting with, which require different kinds of requisite capacities, have time commitments that are associated with them in order for us to become very skillful in how do we, again, complement our wisdom and skill sets, share power in ways that are going to benefit the whole. And again, it really depends on what did we, if you're talking organizationally, what's the mission? What's the vision? What are the values? What are we here to do? What did we come into existence to do? And to what degree is our structure supporting that or hampering that, hindering it? And because it's bigger than all of us. It's bigger than us. It's not about me, which doesn't mean that we don't value individuals. It means we want to do the both and. We want to see this macro, broader systemic impact that we're focusing on and trying to do in advance, while honoring and caring for the individuals within those systems, ourselves included. So, you know, but there's something really fundamental and, I don't know, deceptively easy. Can we be open? Really, can we be open? Can we be open? Can we be open to being wrong? Can we be open to growing? And still at the same time know that we still have brilliance and wonderful things to share, even if over here we are a hot mess. Over here we can be an amazing benefit. And how do we grow over here and then leverage and share these in partnership with others for benefit? So do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Learning from this conversation, it kind of brings about this quality, liberative quality or liberating
Mhm.
quality, and maybe in the institutional or systemic. But I think many of us beginners like myself need to dive more and hear more, learn more, mentor. I think I saw somewhere that you even lead cohorts. So just as
Mhm.
a conclusion, how can people progress further in this work and bring it into their organizations or institutions? Or how do you personally, through movement tapestries, you offer cohorts for further education?
Yeah, so I would say a few things. For some practitioners, again, organizational or equity or systems change practitioners, the publications may be enough. They may find ideas or resources or, think thoughts that spark their practice or help unlock something or deepen something. And that might be totally perfect for them, especially if they've got a lot of organizational development and systems and equity under their belt. They may find that's quite enough. Many people are themselves a part of other cohorts or lead cohorts or a part of communities of practice where they could use those publications as reflection tools or study tools, self-study or reflection tools. So they could totally do that. I do lead cohorts by request, so different organizations will come and say, hey, can you lead a cohort on deep equity or a cohort on change management? So I have several cohorts that are ongoing this year. One just started a few weeks ago. One will start next month. One ended 2 months ago. Another one will start in the fall. So different parts of the social change ecosystem. So I'm definitely open to if there are groups of people, practitioners, whether they're an organization who are like, we have a group, there's minimum, number thresholds, and I'd be happy to talk about that. Um, but if folks came and said, we have a group and we would love to deepen our practice in this, that, or the other area, whether it's spiritual practice connected to equity or equity practice connected to systems change or all three buckets, any combination of those, I'm definitely open to conversation and dialogue. I have a contact page on Movement Tapestries, just contact page, fill out the form, it'll come to me and we can set up some time to chat and see, what might be possible. And there are many other cohorts that folks are holding out in the ecosystem that folks may find beneficial. And I would say if any of those look appealing, check those out. Yeah,
Dr.
thank you.
Grateful for your time and wisdom. And one last direction, we really also wanted to hear about Ocha Dharma. Can
Mm.
you share a little bit about that before we conclude?
Sure, yeah, yeah. So Ocha Dharma, OCHADHARMA.org, so there's a website, is the connection between my Vajrayana practice, my Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana and Bun practice, as well as my African-based practice called Lukumi. Lukumi is a system, as you mentioned in the beginning, based in the Yoruba from West Africa, came to this hemisphere via the slave trade. My particular lineage is via Cuba. And I've practiced Vajrayana as well as Lukumi, both for almost 30 years alongside my profession. And so the emergence of Ocha Dharma as a practice path, sort of formed itself. It seems, what I have always been practicing, but as a path that now is shareable and being shared more broadly. Folks can find out more information on that website. I'm actually going to be doing some upgrades in the coming weeks. My students, gave me some advice on clarifying ways that folks can access upcoming offerings. So folks can take a look, and there are different domains of practice that people can again, by request, request training in. I work one-on-one with select folks and with groups, again, with a minimum threshold number of people, a pre-existing group or a group of folks that forms themselves so that we can go deep together and sort of maintain the container of those practices. So there are about, 5 or 6 practice domains. With subdomains within there. So body, sound, deity, elements, foundational practices. Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Petty. And then once
Thank
again, for
you.
everyone listening, www.movementtapestries.com and www.ochadharma.org. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. Gratitude. Thank you.